This is a guide to paper 1. The years of 1931 to 1941 saw the development of nationalism and militarism in governments in both Europe and Asia. As these regimes began to pursue aggressive foreign policy, the hopes of a peaceful world following the First World War collapsed. Increasingly, the idea of collective security proved to be inadequate, and by 1941 much of the world was involved in a devastating conflict which would cost the lives of millions. This is what you will be tested over for paper 1. First, you possibly might be asked about the growth of Japanese nationalism, militarism, and the resulting expansion of Japan in East Asia and the response of the Western democracies to Japan's actions. It might examine the events that led to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, an event that transformed the European conflict into a global war. The second possible area that it might ask you a question about is Italian fascism and German Nazism. It looks at how the expansionist aims of these governments led to the breakdown in collective security among the European powers and the descent into a European war in 1939. It's important to also remember that while studying for paper 1, all of these serve as causes of World War II for paper 2 or 3. It's important to know the title of your paper 1 topic. It is called Move to Global War. So you want to answer the questions for that topic, and you want to cover the sources for that topic. I will speak more about time later, but I do want you to remember right now that each question you're going to spend 10, 10, 15, 25. That is the time that you should have called by the counselors during this exam. When you are working with sources, you are practicing a key component of being a historian, where you apply the evidence to a research question and use the sources to attempt to draw conclusions. In paper 1, you will demonstrate understanding of historical sources. You will interpret and analyze information from a variety of sources. You will compare and contrast information between sources. You will evaluate sources for their value and limitations. And you will summarize evidence from the sources with your own detailed knowledge of the topic. Paper 1 is a key advantage to you because you know the format going in. You know exactly what type of questions they're going to ask and what topics they're going to ask it about. You can predict the nature and style of the 4 questions on this paper. This means that you can also learn and practice the correct approach for each of these questions and maximize the marks you get. The majority of the marks on this paper are actually awarded for skill and not knowledge. The 4 sources on this paper will be a selection of both primary and secondary sources. The length of each source may vary, but the total length of the paper should not exceed 750 words in total. One of the 4 sources will be a visual rather than a text-based source. For example, a photograph, cartoon, table of statistics, graph, or map. One of your paper 1 topics could be Japanese expansionism in East Asia. They might ask you about the causes of expansion, the events, or the responses by the international community. You want to keep in mind that they will never ask you anything outside of 1931 to 1941. So this begins with the Manchurian situation and ends with the bombing at Pearl Harbor. They won't ask you anything that goes into detail in World War II. So this is a study guide that'll help you. You won't know if they're going to ask you about Japanese expansionism or our second case study until you get your exam. The second case study is German and Italian expansionism. Again, you won't know if they ask you, but you will know that if they ask you, they'll ask you about both. So it'll be about German and Italian expansionism. You're going to want to know the causes of expansion, the events, and the responses of the international community. You also want to remember that for both of these, you're actually also studying for a possible question on paper 2 or paper 3 about the causes of World War II. The first question is actually in 2 parts, and it's worth 5 marks, and you should only spend 10 minutes on it. This is made up of a 3-mark and a 2-mark component, giving you a possible total of 5 marks. It is assessing your historical comprehension of the sources. You do not need to give your own detailed knowledge in your response. This is the only question that asks you to explain the content and meaning of the documents. Part A is worth 3 marks and asks you to comprehend, extract, and possibly infer information. First, write firstly, secondly, thirdly, to ensure that you make at least 3 separate points. Do not repeat the same point you have already made, and do not over-rely on quotes. Make your own point and then briefly quote 2 or 3 words of the source in support. You do not want to answer too much using those quotes. Part B, you should try to make 2 clear points for this question. For each point, refer specifically to the content of the source to provide evidence for your answer. For parts A and B, you should not need to bring in your own knowledge. However, your contextual understanding of the topic and sources should enable you to understand more clearly the content and message of each source. Stated 10 minutes. Big mistake, common mistake is kids, this is the first question, they write too long on it. They make it too lengthy. You need 3 points in part A, 2 points in part B. Make them, do it quickly, move on. Your second question is worth 4 marks, and it is your OCVL question. You spend 10 minutes on it, answer, you're evaluating one source, and you need to move quickly, do it fast. All of you know how to do this. This is the part A of your IA. So for this question, you need to evaluate one source in terms of its value and limitations by examining its origin, purpose, and content. This question again is worth 4 marks. To find the origin and purpose, look carefully at the source. For origin, who wrote it, said it, or drew it? When did the person write it, say it, or draw it? Where did the person write it, say it, or draw it? And what is the source? A speech, a cartoon, a textbook, etc. For purpose, why did the person write it, say it, or draw it? And who did the person write it, say it, or draw it for? For content, is the language objective, or does it sound exaggerated or one-sided? What is the tone of this source? What information and examples do they select or focus on to support their opinion? For the information you have on origins of the source and what you can infer about the document's purpose, you must then explain the value and limitations the source has for historians researching a particular event or period in history. The most common secondary source that you will have to deal with is one from a textbook or historian. Again, the key questions of what is the origin of this source and what is the source's purpose need to be addressed in order to work out the value and limitations of the source in question. Some examples of values when dealing with a historian are they're usually professional experts in the field, they have benefited of hindsight which is not present in contemporary sources, and may offer sources based on a range of documents. Some of the limitations of historians might have a broad focus to their work or might have very specific or narrow focus, might be an expert in a different region or era from the one they are writing about, and they may be influenced by their nationality, experience, politics, or context. Also, you might find one of the sources is a biographer. Values of biographers are they have detailed individual knowledge of that person. They may provide sources that have value due to tone, use of language and expression, and sometimes have the benefit of hindsight. Some of the limitations, if they might have become too involved with their subject and lost their objectivity, may focus on the role of subjects of their biography at the expense of other individuals or factors, and might not have direct access to the subject. They may have limitations due to tone, use of language, and expression. The third question is worth 6 marks, and you spend 15 minutes answering it. This question will ask you to compare and contrast two sources. Your aim is to identify similar themes and ideas in two sources, and to also identify differences between them. It is marked out of a total of 6. You get 3 marks for comparing and 3 marks for showing the differences. The key to this question is linking the documents together. You are expected to discuss the sources together throughout your response. You must find both similarities and differences. This is best presented as 2 separate paragraphs, one for comparison and one for contrast. Here are some tips from examiners of papers in years past. You should practice finding similarities, underline or highlight the similarities and differences while you're reading your documents. You must make sure that you mention both sources in everything you write. The skill you are demonstrating is linking. I'll tell you how to do that in a little bit. Always be clear about which source you are discussing. Find both the more obvious similarities and differences, and then go on to identify more specific comparisons and contrasts. Deal with similarities in your first paragraph and differences in your second. Ensure that each point you make is clearly stated. If you quote from the sources, make this brief. Quote only 2 or 3 words to support your point. Do not introduce your answer or attempt to reach a conclusion. This is not necessary and wastes time. Do not discuss why the sources are similar or different. Your job is to focus on how the sources are similar and different. It is asking you to look at the content of the sources. This question is not asking you why the sources might be similar or different. Do not use grids, charts, or bullet points. Always write in full paragraphs. It is not a full, valid contrast to identify what is simply mentioned in one source but not the other. Example, source A mentions that played a role, whereas source B does not mention this. That is not linkage. Also, how to draw comparisons and show similarities. You need to mention both sources in each sentence. So you would do something like, to draw conclusion or similarities, both source A and source B. Or you could write source A suggests, similarly, source B suggests, or you could write source A supports source B, or like source B, source A says, or lastly, in the same way that source B argues, source A points out that. Also, this is a way to draw contrasts or show differences. Again, you need to mention each document in every sentence. So you would do source A suggests, however, source B says, or you could write source B disagrees with source A regarding, or you could write source A claims as opposed to source B, which asserts. Lastly, you could write source B goes further than source A in arguing, while A focuses on. Again, remember, every sentence you have needs to have both sources listed in it. One paragraph will show comparison, the other paragraph will show differences. The fourth question is worth 9 marks, and you should answer this in 25 minutes. I strongly suggest spending the first 5 minutes planning how to write this essay once you have read the prompt question. This question requires you to write a mini essay. The key to this question is that an essay is required, not a list of material from each source. However, you are required to use each source in this essay. Again, I strongly suggest that you spend at least 5 minutes planning your essay. I would get your argument together, then each source used like as a number, put which sources support your argument and which one might offer a differing opinion of your argument. Once you have your sources labeled or organized, you know which one is going to support your argument, which one's going to offer a differing opinion. And if you have a couple of minutes, start just jotting down your own knowledge so that while you're writing, you don't freeze up. Okay, starting with a nice chart that kind of summarizes events, dates, statistics, viewpoints, and analysis can help you out. Once you start writing, you will need to write only a brief sentence of introduction. You, again, much like I said with Part B of your IA, move into it. When using sources, refer to them directly as source A, source E, and so on. You don't have to write who wrote it or anything like that. You can quote briefly from the sources throughout the essay, but quoting 2 or 3 words is enough. Never quote more than 2 or 3 words. Use all of the sources in this essay and include your own detailed knowledge. Write a brief conclusion which should answer the question and be in line with the evidence you have given. If you follow this formula, you can score major points with this. The fourth question is assessed using kind of a generic mark brand. If you want that 7 through 9, your response needs to be focused on the question. You need to make clear references to the sources, and these references are used effectively as evidence to support your analysis. And lastly, if you want that 7 to 9 points, you need to be accurate and relevant own knowledge demonstrated to the grader. There is effective summarization of own knowledge and source material. A key issue of this paper is managing your time effectively in the exam. If you do not work through the questions efficiently, you could run out of time. You must allow enough time to answer the fourth question. After all, this is worth the most marks on your paper. You will have 1 hour to complete paper 1. At the beginning of the examination, you have 5 minutes reading time when you are not allowed to write anything. I recommend that you use your 5 minutes reading time to read through the questions first. This will give you an initial understanding of what you are looking for when you read the sources. Read through the questions and then begin to read through the sources. I suggest that you follow this time very, very strongly. And that is question 1, 10 minutes, question 2, 10 minutes, third question, 15 minutes, fourth question, 25 minutes. If you have any time left, you have not answered these questions correctly, go back and fill in where you're missing stuff. You can do this. It's your easiest exam. All the information is there. Study those trends, know those trends. Understand too that everything you're studying paper 1 might appear on paper 2, certainly might appear on paper 3 as well. Good luck, dears.